Okay, in this video I'm going to talk about functional groups, describe what they are and give some examples of them and how to identify them. um, Organic chemistry is structured around the idea that we have a carbon backbone, right? Things that we've been calling alkanes. So if we think of any sort of carbon backbone, skeletal structure, we can think of this as being the backbone where interesting chemistries can be put. And the interesting chemistries that we put on this relatively uninteresting alkane backbone are called functional groups. So right now we can think of this alkane as not really functional, but if we put some different atoms on there, perhaps maybe it'll become functional. And by functional, we usually mean reactive in some way. So let's start with some carbon backbone like this and try to add something interesting to it that might make it reactive. And really the whole philosophy behind organic chemistry is that there's thousands and thousands and thousands of different organic molecules, and you can never really memorize the reactivity of each of them. But if you can look at an organic molecule and find out what different types of functional groups are present in that molecule, you might be able to understand the chemistry of that molecule just by describing the individual chemistries of each of the functional groups that are contributing to that molecule. Sort of a modular system, saying that a molecule is reactive in a way that's the sum of its different parts. The parts being these individual functional groups. And so let me show you some examples of functional groups. Over here I'm going to put a sort of a boring alkane. You would say there's really no functional groups in there, it's just an alkane. But if we add some extra electrons and a double bond there, we can say that this molecule now has a functional group inside of it, and that functional group is called an alkene. We call this an alkene instead of an alkane. This double bond can be at the end, it can be in the middle. Here's another example of an alkene, a carbon-carbon double bond. Okay. Another one could be a triple bond, and then this would be an alkyne. Now there's another type of functional group that involves double bonds within a carbon chain, and this one's very special. We call this an arene ring. This molecule is benzene, and it has an arene ring in it. Actually, it just is an arene ring. Now this looks like it's just a bunch of alkenes together, a bunch of carbon-carbon double bonds, but we label this as a special functional group because, as we'll see later in this semester, the arrangement of these carbon-carbon double bonds in this molecule give it a different function than just a normal alkene, so it deserves its own name. Okay, now let's show some functional groups where we're adding different types of atoms. Here's one. We've added an electronegative halogen to this. We call this an alkyl halide. Sometimes you can just call it a halide. That halogen, can be any halogen. It could be iodine, bromine, chlorine, fluorine, whatever. Those are all different alkyl halides. And this halogen can be put anywhere on the molecule. Let's turn this thing into an alkyl halide, and we'll put a chlorine here. Okay, these are both alkyl halides, so it doesn't really matter where this halogen is added. It's still the same type of functional group, but we can sort of start to think about how to discriminate between these two types of alkyl halide by looking at what carbon this halogen is attached to. Usually the carbon that's directly attached to our functional group we call an alpha carbon. So in this case right here, this carbon right here that's directly bound to the halogen we'd call an alpha carbon. This molecule up here, our alpha carbon, would be that one right there. And if you look, we can say, well, this alpha carbon is bound to one other carbon, and so we can call this a primary alkyl halide. primary, indicating that the alpha carbon is only bound to one other carbon. This alkyl halide, its alpha carbon is bound to two other carbons, so we would call this a secondary alkyl halide. We can indicate this just with a 1, the superscript, 2, superscript. That's primary, secondary. We can also have tertiary functional groups. This sort of nomenclature doesn't just pertain to alkyl halides. It can go for almost any functional group that we're talking about. Okay, that's alkyl halides. Let's look at some more examples. This is a very, very common functional group. This is an alcohol. Think about what type of alcohol is this. Is this a primary alcohol, secondary alcohol, tertiary alcohol? Think about that. Here we have an oxygen in the middle of a carbon chain, and we call this an ether. Ethers typically aren't that reactive. They're used as solvents. This one is called diethyl ether because it has an ethyl group on either side of the oxygen. And we use that in laboratory as a solvent. These functional groups that I'm putting here, these aren't the only way you can make these functional groups, right? This is an alcohol, but so is this an alcohol, and that's an alcohol. The carbon chain that's attached to the interesting atoms we can think of as an R group, just a bunch of carbons. So we can think of a generic way of indicating an alcohol as some R group, any sort of carbons attached to the thing that defines that functional group as an alcohol, an OH. An ether, has an R group on either side of that oxygen, and that R group doesn't have to be the same. So we'll call this one R, R prime. In our case of diethyl ether, R is ethyl, R prime is also ethyl. Does that make sense? Okay, here's another example of a functional group. Let's look at this one, NH2. Right. This is an amine. These are basic molecules usually, and they smell bad. There's a lot of amines in fish, and that's why a lot of times we put acid on fish, like lemon juice, in order to neutralize the smelly amines that give it a fishy taste. This is a molecule that's a lot like an alcohol. It has a sulfur instead of oxygen, and we call this a thiol. These are present in a lot of proteins. If we put that sulfur in the middle, we call this a sulfide. And if we have two sulfurs together, we call that a disulfide. The reason I'm mentioning this functional group is because this is very important in protein structure. You may have heard in biology class, if you've taken intro biology, of disulfide bonds, where two cysteine amino acids in a protein bind together through a disulfide bond or bridge that holds a protein together. Okay, all of these functional groups that we've talked about are really an alpha carbon bound to a more electronegative atom, whether that electronegative atom is a sulfur or an oxygen or a nitrogen or a halogen. Okay, but there's a different class of functional groups that we'll talk about here, and these all have what we call a carbonyl in them. Now, a carbonyl isn't a functional group, but a carbonyl is present in a bunch of functional groups. We call a carbon double bound to an oxygen a carbonyl, and there are carbonyls in different functional groups. Here's a functional group that contains a carbonyl. That carbonyl is at the end of our carbon chain, and we call this an aldehyde. Here we have a carbonyl that's in the middle of a carbon chain, and we call that a ketone. Again, we could indicate sort of a generic way of thinking about these functional groups. by putting R groups instead of particular carbon chains. Here's a very important functional group that we'll talk about a lot later in the semester. This looks like an alcohol that has a carbonyl associated with it. It turns out the presence of this carbonyl makes that alcohol acidic. So this is a carboxylic acid functional group. We can put this carbonyl next to something like an ether. Here we've got that oxygen bound to a CH3 methyl group there. We call this functional group an ester. We can put our carbonyl next to something that looks like an amine. And we can call that an amide. And finally, we can put our carbonyl next to our halogen. And we call this one an acid halide, or in this case, an acid chloride. Acid chlorides are the most common ones. They're very useful for substitution reactions that we'll see later in the semester. Okay. All of these are carbonyl containing functional groups, and as you'll see later in the semester, this is a real functional piece of a molecule. This carbon has electrons being pulled from it by the electronegative oxygen, so we think of this oxygen being a little negative, carbon being a little positive. Negative things like to react with that carbon, positive things may react with the oxygen. That makes it functional, makes it reactive. Okay, the last thing I want to look at is here's a molecule, right? It's a big, ugly, nasty organic molecule, and I just made this up. I don't even know if this thing exists, but this is an example of how we can use these functional groups to try to describe organic molecules. Now, what's the reactivity of this thing? Who knows, right? We didn't memorize what it is. We'd have to look it up in a book to see if it even exists, or maybe we synthesized it new and we're trying to predict its reactivity. Well, what we're going to say is, well, it's just a carbon chain that is sort of peppered or decorated with these functional groups. And each of these functional groups has its own chemistry. And so the chemistry of this entire molecule is really just a sum of the different functional groups that are in it. So what you need to be able to do is identify and name the different types of functional groups. And really during organic chemistry, we'll march through these functional groups and learn about their reactivity and how to make them, how to name them. And by the end of the course, you'll be able to look at some brand new molecule and be able to give a pretty good description of its reactivity based on what you know about the individual functional groups that are present there. Okay, so what do you see in this thing? Well, if we start from the left side of the molecule, what is this? Well, it's got an oxygen buried in between carbon chain. That looks like an ether. Here's an ether. What's this guy down here? This looks like an alcohol. As we look into alcohols a little more deep, we'll notice this is going to be actually a special alcohol called a phenol, because that alcohol is directly attached to an arene ring. So this molecule has lots of functional groups in it so far: ether, arene, alcohol. There's an amine. We'd call this a secondary amine because it's bound to two other carbons. Here we've got a carbonyl group that is stuck right in the middle of a carbon chain, so that is a ketone. That's next to a carbon-carbon double bond. That's an alkene. And, well, we've got another carbonyl that looks like it's next to an alcohol. This whole shebang right here is a carboxylic acid. So this is a crazy complicated molecule that has a bunch of different functional groups in it, and we would predict its chemistry and its reactivity would be a combination of all of the different functions that are present in these functional groups.